I'm going to kind of introduce our speaker today and give you a little bit of information. And to our virtual attendees, when we get a question from the audience, we're going to try to remember to repeat that. But also, I will give our virtual attendees, we'll find out how they can post questions to a Padlet board. And then during the talk, I will moderate those questions. And then I will actually state the questions to our speaker, okay? So virtual attendees, be ready with your own questions as well. And a lot of folks that attendees, our speaker has been out here actually a couple of times, and it's always really great and really informative. And she is able to speak to an audience that tends to know very little about immigration policy, okay? It's hard, it's complex. So she'll be able to help you out. So any kind of question you have, in the most basic question, don't think that it's dumb. A lot of people are very uninformed when it comes to immigration. So the reason we're here today, not just to talk about immigration, but to celebrate Constitution Day, which is this Friday, September 17th, when Congress adopted the United States Constitution we live over now with, of course, some changes. And that was done September 17th in 1787. And our speaker today, and I'm going to move through a few more, Danielle, before you start, but our speaker today is Danielle Claffey. Did I have the C right?
Yeah.
I always forget it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
A Kuck-Baxter Immigration, a very prominent immigration law firm in Atlanta. So they have hands-on, very practical experience and expertise in the subject of immigration. Let me start this really quickly here. All right. And I want to, this slide might end up changing because this will kind of pop up throughout our presentation. But I want to remind you, since we are talking about the Constitution, we're supposed to be commemorating the Constitution. The Constitution does speak on the policies of naturalization and also anything some things relevant to immigration. And then the rest of that is handled by federal law. So for example, Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress has the power to set uniform rules of naturalization. And the naturalization, to be naturalized, is to become a citizen, okay? You might be familiar with the Birthright Citizenship Clause in the 14th Amendment that we get. 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. And of course, we had the issue of slaves becoming free and not having citizenship. This would give all these folks citizenship and the benefits and privileges that come with that. We know there were some challenges to that, of course, for decades. So if you're, for example, if you're naturalized in the United States, you become a citizen after coming here, you're a citizen of the U.S. and citizen of the state, and then you're entitled to privileges and immunities. The amendment goes on from there. But it also establishes, again, that if you are born, okay, in the United States and under the jurisdiction of the United States, then you are a U.S. citizen, okay? We do have some people that are not born in maybe one of the 50 states, but they're born on U.S. territory, or they're born, if they're allowed citizens, or they're born like on a U.S. military base in Germany, or born to American parents. So there's other ways than just being born in the 50 United States. For example, John McCain, the late Senator John McCain ran for president. He is considered a natural-born citizen, even though he was born in the Panama Canal Zone. Okay, so there's a lot of confusion about that as well. But also, and I think Danielle will be able to speak to this quite a bit, and correct me if there's any misunderstanding here, but the Constitution often speaks to persons, okay? Persons. So even those that are here and that are not citizens do have some basic constitutional rights, like rights to due process and that kind of thing, as you would have if you were in another democracy. You would want those same protections. But there are some limitations. It doesn't mean that, for example, undocumented immigrants are afforded some of the same benefits that we're able to get. So Danielle maybe can speak about that really quickly. I'll move on so we can get you started. I want to remind you guys too that we will have an election talk here tomorrow at 1 p.m. and it is being streamed as well. But please go to vote.gsu.edu. Check to see if you're registered to vote. You can find out if you're not sure. It'll tell you. You'll pop up in the system, the Secretary of State of Georgia system. And you can find out other information like, where do I vote, ballot information, and here are some of our upcoming elections. If you're in Atlanta, you can vote in the mayoral race. It's coming up soon. And then our big midterm election is next year, and that includes primaries in the summer and the general election in November. And we'll be moving on here really quickly. If you're interested in attending any of the other events, you can go to service.gsu.edu. And then, okay, I think that was it. I'm not seeing the Padlet one. Oh, that's right, because I added it. That's okay. Oops, I can't put it in slideshow mode. If you are a virtual attendee, so my in-person folks, if you'll just verbally ask your question, please. But if you're an in-person attendee, and I'm going to leave this up for a little bit, if you will put in that web address, or if you're able to see this on your home computer, you can use your camera and just do the QR code and it'll open up on your phone. And please post any questions you have so that our virtual attendees can interact with the speaker as well and get their questions answered. I will moderate those. They will not pop up on Padlet immediately. I have to approve those, and then I will ask questions for you as long as the question is appropriate, and also depending on the time we have. So if I am not able to get to your question, please forgive me, but we are limited in time, okay? So I'll introduce our speaker and she'll get started. Again, this is Danielle Claffey from Kuck-Baxter Immigration.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you.
All right. Hey guys, hope everyone's doing well. So first, Barbara and everyone at GSU, thanks for having me back. It's now been 2 years, I think, since the last time I was here. So I've been here a few times before, but obviously because of circumstances, I missed out last year. And I will tell you the difference between the time I was here 2 years ago and now has been drastic in some really positive ways, some ways that have sort of remained stagnant, surprisingly, a few negative ways, but I kind of want to talk about, obviously we're here for Constitution Week, so I don't want to just go through, here's all the different types of visas and here's what you can do. I kind of just want to focus on where we are with immigration, what we think might happen, and different things like that. So I appreciate Barbara starting out by taking a quick snapshot of the 14th Amendment, talking a little bit about due process rights and things like that, because the first thing that I want to mention, just to supplement what Barbara had said, is that, the United States offers birthright citizenship, right? Essentially, you're born in the United States on U.S. soil or on a territory or a military base, like she had said, you are a U.S. citizen, whether or not your parent or parents are or not. And there's, of course, been a lot of debate over that over the years. There are many countries out there that don't offer birthright citizenship. And so it can be a very different circumstance for those individuals. We do have that here in the United States, which, of course, has also contributed to a lot of the debate when it comes to immigration. Should children born in the U.S. of parents who are immigrants, particularly undocumented, have that benefit or that right? Well, it's written into our Constitution, and unless and until that were to ever change, that is what our law says. But there is one exception that's always interesting that I actually have dealt with personally. The part of the language, and I know it's not up here right now, but when it talks about the 14th Amendment and it says, or subject to the jurisdiction thereof, I've dealt with this issue before. So sometimes, we have consular officers, consular generals, ambassadors, and things like that from other countries that come to work temporarily in the U.S. that are based at the embassies of different countries around the world. And I've actually dealt with this when a child is born in the United States and they are the child of an ambassador or a consular general. Even though they're born at Northside in Atlanta, they are not a U.S. citizen. They are conferred no status in the U.S. So that's actually the one super limited exception to somebody being born in the United States that does not automatically gain or acquire U.S. citizenship, because technically they are still born in the country where they're from. Okay, even though they're born in Atlanta or wherever it is in the U.S. So that's just a really interesting part of the 14th Amendment, that we've actually had to litigate issues like that, because for a long time in years past, the U.S. State Department, even though the Constitution says that, they were mistakenly issuing U.S. passports to certain individuals, children that grew up and remained in the U.S. and may have then gone on to study and work and different things like that, and just assumed they were a U.S. citizen, issued a U.S. passport, and suddenly 20 some odd years later, they go to renew their passport again, and suddenly they can't because the US State Department says, you're not a US citizen, you never were, you don't have a right to this passport. So it's just, it can be very shocking, and it's a little teeny tiny part of area of the law, but I thought it was interesting just to mention that. The other thing I want to mention too, only because it happened right before I was about to start speaking, is when immigrants, whether documented, undocumented, have visas or green cards, anytime they need help locally, right? So if you need help with Comcast or Xfinity, and you need to go pick up something, right? You may either make a call, make an appointment, you go in and you get your cable box and you get your customer service and you're on your way, right? When an immigrant needs something like a stamp in their passport to travel or a copy of a document or something like that, that can only be gotten by physically going into the local immigration office, which is about 40 minutes away. The system changed a couple of years ago, kind of during our last administration, where they said, you can't just make an appointment. It used to take 5 minutes. We make an appointment online. We have our date. We go with them and what have you. They changed it and said, you now have to make a phone call. You call the National Customer Service Center. We're the ones who decide whether you meet the requirements for an appointment or not. So if somebody needs to travel internationally, that sort of thing, they have to make an appointment, go to the local office, get what they need to, and so on. Well, things have gotten so crazy where it used to take a day or two or you get somebody on the phone immediately. Now immigration, when you call them, you get escalated, kind of like any other customer service. And they say, okay, we're going to call you back in a day or 2 days. Now it's 30 days. And then it was 30 days as of about 2 weeks ago. And then now it's 45 days. And it keeps just getting longer and longer and longer. Well, here's the tricky part. Most clients can't really do this because they don't quite know what to say and making sure they have all the right information. So us as attorneys do it for the most part. But the thing is, when they call us back, I have no way of knowing when they're going to call me back. So they'll tell me, the last they told me was 30 days, you're going to get a call back. Well, when is it going to be? It could be any time of the day from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. Monday through Friday during business hours, and they don't call back again. You have one chance to answer the phone call. So of course, at 11:34, 28 days after I called, I just got my call back. So what happens now is I can't help my client. I have to call USCIS back again and say, hey, I need to schedule another call. It does not matter what I'm doing. I could be in the hospital, I can be in court or whatever. If I miss that call, my client misses the appointment that they need to make, which is also another 30 days out from now. So it just kind of gives you a small idea of what people need to do. And these are for the most part individuals who are documented because again, they're just going in for an extension or something they need to be able to travel. Sometimes that's emergency. These people don't care at all. So I just missed my call. I can't just call them back and say, hey, I missed the call because I was about to speak at Georgia State. Can you do me? Nope. Sorry, I have to start the entire process over again. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of glimpse of some of the things that we kind of have to deal with just in terms of customer service, let alone policy and the laws and so on. So what I want to talk about today is, where we were 2 years ago versus kind of where we are now. 2 years ago, I came in here trying to explain how many people are being detained, how many people are being, removed and ordered removed and turned away at the border and held in camps on the other side, on the other side of the border from the US-Mexico border. Well, those things are still happening, but they're slowly sort of being worked on and worked out. There are still many, many thousands of individuals that are just on the other side of the Mexican border remaining in camps until they're able to seek their asylum status and their application in the United States. Now, mind you, one thing that I think is typically really unclear and unknown is why in the world do we give these people a right to do this, to try to get into the US, to say that they have a right to be here? And it's because it's written into our US immigration laws, which is the Immigration and Nationality Act, and because it's also taken from international law. International human rights, okay? Because there are asylum laws all around the world, and all of the asylum laws generally adhere to international law and to international protections that come from the Hague Convention, and that's where really all of that is sourced. And so what our immigration laws say is, if somebody presents themselves to a border officer, to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or to Customs and Border Patrol, they have a legal right to request permission to be in the United States to ask for help and protection for whatever the reason might be, okay? And that doesn't mean that it's an open-ended, unfettered, they can just, come here for whatever reason. They do have to be able to establish the legal right to be here in the US. But that can never, ever be determined on the spot at the port of entry with a split decision made. I have asylum cases, because that's what I'm kind of talking about here is asylum, where somebody's requesting protection from their home country. I have asylum cases that have been going on 8 or 10 years. I have an asylum trial at the end of the month that was first filed back in 2011 and referred to immigration court, and we are finally going to trial on that at the end of this month. And that is through no fault of the individuals, it's just that our courts are so backlogged, that's how long it can take. And I'm not going to say that many individuals don't try to enter the United States for economic benefit, to be able to work, send money back to their families. But, and that is true, and that does not provide a basis to be able to apply for asylum. There's basically 5 general ways to apply for asylum. So if somebody presents themselves at the border, they say, I want to apply for asylum because I fear that I'm going to be killed or harmed again based on my religion or based on my national origin or my ethnicity, based on my political beliefs. I have lots and lots of Venezuelan clients right now that have pending asylum applications based on their political beliefs. Right? And so there are all these different bases. And one of the largest groups is called being a member of a particular social group. And in some ways it's a catch-all because it excludes the religion, the political affiliations and things like that. But in other ways, we as immigration attorneys have to be very, very specific in how we define who's a member of a particular social group, okay? And I know it's sort of a generic term, but I'll explain what that means. You've probably heard tons and tons about Central American kids coming up to the United States, right? Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras for the most part because of gang recruitment, particularly young boys, but many, many times young girls because they're recruited for different reasons, right? They're subjected to harm for different reasons. And so that's probably the biggest thing that we hear about from these Central American countries are these kids coming up, but sometimes there have been waves where they come up in droves. They're talking about 30,000, 50,000 coming up. And what do we do in these situations? And on the one hand, it is difficult. And I completely understand when individuals say, well, how can we just keep letting these kids in? How can we provide for them? How can we properly accommodate them when they're detained at the port of entry? How do we know? Why are they not being released, within 2 days of processing, which is what the law requires, rather than being held for a week? And I completely understand those circumstances, right? But that's why them just coming to the port of entry and asking for help does not automatically mean that we just give them a pass and say, okay, you can stay here permanently. It still means that these kids and even the adults are facing the next 2, 3, 5 years of going through an immigration court process in order to be able to stay in the United States lawfully if they can meet the legal requirement. Okay, and so some might think, well, these, potentially recruited gang members and things like that, how are they ever going to meet the requirements? And the truth is, most of the time, they cannot. Because unfortunately, the way that our precedent case law, so not the Immigration and Nationality Act, not what's written into the statute, but the case law that has been produced has basically said, attempts to be recruited by a gang is not specific and particular enough to establish a basis for asylum, okay? And so I've heard countless stories. So I've heard personal one-on-one stories from a 15-year-old boy who said, I just had to stop going to school and I had to stay at home because every single time I was walking down the road, going into school, the standard gang members who ran the town with their machine guns and their whatever weapons that they had every single day were threatening me, and it was getting so bad. It was either I knew I was going to join this gang and I was going to end up being forced to harm or hurt other people, or I was going to stay home, or I was going to flee. And that's what happens over and over and over again. So I've never been in their shoes. I couldn't imagine, but I hear these stories and I think there's got to be some way to address this. And while I know that addressing it doesn't mean just, again, a free pass to these tens of thousands of children, these are some of the reasons that I hope for some changes and alterations to our immigration laws that can properly account in some better controlled but appropriate way to try to help children. We are all essentially from immigrants, right? Immigration is never going to stop. It's never going to go away. But we as immigration attorneys as well also want to find the best, most appropriate ways to be able to handle the influx of immigration, the constant movement of immigration to our country, because it's never going to go away. So we want to be able to handle it properly. And I think that's where we get into the most debate and the most conflict, because anytime any bill is proposed, the first thing that happens is, oh my God, this is amnesty. This is going to give a free pass to everybody. You know, it's going to be just like it was in the 80s with Reagan amnesty, and this is not fair because there's no penalty and anybody can just do it and it's inappropriate. And on the one hand, maybe I understand a little bit just the resistance to the idea of amnesty. But on the other hand, if we don't reform it, you know, all laws are not going to work for all time for everybody. There has to be some changes and some developments. And I know that there are individuals who strictly and strongly adhere to the Constitution as it's written. And there are other individuals that understand that, yes, the Constitution, there's obviously a strict and a strong basis to it, but there's also ways to interpret through bills and through the passage of acts and interpretation of laws and things like that. And so I think it has to be a balance between the two so that we can properly address it on both ends, not just let everybody and anybody, but at the same time have a controlled manner, right? And so I know a lot of individuals also think, well, what if we just let anybody in and they have these criminal convictions and, you know, we're letting dangerous people in? Absolutely, there's an element of that. I would never, ever propose that anybody coming into the United States, that some percentage of them are not going to be harmful or dangerous individuals or have some type of criminal history. That's just like individuals in the US, right? So we have US citizens, lots and lots of people go to jail and get arrested for committing crimes. And it's not comparable because these individuals who are immigrating to the US are asking permission to be here, right? And so what a lot of people don't realize is that when somebody's trying to immigrate to the US, if they do have a criminal background, one, it will get picked up 99.99% of the time, because anybody who files any type of immigration application whatsoever is subjected to fingerprints. And the FBI checks their fingerprints not just for the United States, but all around the world, globally. So anything that has ever happened will get picked up. So for me as an immigration attorney, I would rather have a client go through a process where they do have to present themselves and have their fingerprints run to make sure to check their background, rather than have a process that really continues to foster the undocumented immigration and individuals crossing the border, where unless they come to me and unless legally under the law I can help them, then I know that there's no way we're able to present them for fingerprint checks and background checks. So in our office, we have a fingerprint machine. We have our own digital fingerprint machine. So nearly every client that comes into us, if there's anything that we're going to do, one of the first things we do, if they're not sure, hey, I think I may have had an outstanding warrant from California from 25 years ago, I'm not really sure, it was a DUI, this, that, or the other, first thing we do is run fingerprints, right? Because we need to be able to ensure that the individuals we're helping to process for documents in the US are also able to clear and pass those checks. So my feeling and my support for immigration reform and being able to help to update and modernize our laws is really for the purpose of kind of helping to reduce the number of individuals coming across the border unlawfully and then possibly being here for years and years without any fingerprint checks, without any path to file for an immigration application. So, you know, there is of course, the view that individuals come across and why should they have that right and why should they benefit from it. And I understand that. I understand when some of my own clients say to me, well, wait a minute, I came over with a visa, and this is what I get most often. So most of my European clients and clients from other countries where there's not a land border come over with visas. They come over on B2 visitor visas, they come over on F1 student visas, or they come over on a variety of other type of work visas. Well, do you know how many of those individuals end up overstaying their visas in the United States, either because they're not in a position to leave the US, they don't have the financial means, or then they've started working, or they've met somebody and had a family, all kinds of different situations. But then they turn around and say to me, well, I should be able to go through this, but not that guy who crossed the Mexican border because he came through unlawfully. And I said, yeah, but what it all boils down to is you are here just as unlawfully as the person who crossed the border. It's just the different way that you came through. But getting permission to come through and then overstaying it doesn't change the fact that you're currently here without status, right? And so I have to have that conversation. But the difficult part is, and here's the big difference, if somebody comes over here on a visa and they overstay it, and then they marry a US citizen, or they end up having children in the US that eventually turn 21 years old, that parent or spouse can typically file for a green card in the US, okay? And it's the great benefit of being married to a US citizen, and it's the reason that there are automatic red flags with marriage, with green cards based on marriage. Because everybody knows, once you learn anything about immigration, that it's really the easiest way to get a green card. It's the fastest, it's the easiest, so we really have to do a lot to prove that it is a valid marriage, because the fact is there's a lot of marriage fraud out there. There's a lot that we have to vet. I have certainly had individuals come into my office and sit down as a purported married couple, you know, and the more I talk to them, I just say to myself, I do not have a good feeling here. This just does not feel right, things like that. So we also have to be wary and careful of that. But on the flip side of things, when somebody crosses the border, the Mexican border or the Canadian border, comes into the US without papers, without permission, without a visa, and that same individual marries somebody who's a US citizen eventually, they have children, many times they'll come to me and say, hey, my son is about to turn 21, can I go ahead and file for a green card? I've been paying taxes for 20 years, I don't have any criminal history, I'm just here working, I'm doing the best I can I file for a green card? And I have to say, unfortunately, you can't. You're not eligible, and you have to go spend 10 years in your home country before you can ever go through the process for a green card. It doesn't matter. And so that is the big difference between somebody who crosses the border unlawfully without papers versus somebody who crosses with a visa and simply overstays. That visa alone, even though they violated it, is what gives them the permission to file here versus the other person who has to wait back in their home country for 10 years, okay? Another way that we're able to sort of rectify people who come across the border without papers, even if they're married to a US citizen, they have kids, they have a family, they're working, they're good people, is I talk to them about a process that as of right now will take about 3 years, okay? And much of that is because globally the consulates have, because of COVID, essentially were shut down for a while and slowly started resuming things, okay? In order for that person who crossed to be able to get a green card, they have to go to an interview in their home country. In order to go to an interview in their home country, they have to face the prospect of leaving and not knowing if they're ever going to get back, because that happens too. Well, in order for them to get permission to legally come back, we have to file something called a waiver application for them to request forgiveness for crossing the border unlawfully and being here in the US for at least a year or more, and they have to show that it's going to cause exceptional hardship to their US citizen spouse. And that's the only pathway that they can go through to be able to leave, go for an interview, and return to the US with a green card, okay? That's also a scary prospect, but pretty reasonable process for us. When I tell somebody, look, it's probably gonna take 2.5, 3 years, to me, that's fast. To them, it's like, oh my God, I thought I'd be able to go through this a little faster and get my status corrected. Because one of the biggest, I think, myths and misnomers is thinking that people who come undocumented without papers don't want to have papers, that they want to stay hidden, they want to stay under the radar. Not true at all. I have done countless consultations with clients or prospective clients that have come back to me over, so I've been doing this 14 years with my current law firm. They literally will come back every 2 to 3 years to ask me if there have been any changes, any developments, anything they didn't hear about on TV. Is there any possibility? I'm still paying my taxes. I'm still doing this. I still have no criminal history. Can I file anything yet? And I have to tell them, if they weren't eligible 2 years ago, they're still not eligible now. And same thing with 8 or 10 years ago. So again, that's another reason why, yes, I'm a supporter of some level of immigration reform because, again, being able to help individuals who are here, right? Even if it comes down to them paying fines or penalty fees or what have you to be able to remain in the U.S., because that's typically what comes along with reform, having them submit to background checks. So we know they're individuals who, criminally speaking, are eligible because they don't have the type of backgrounds that we wouldn't want in the U.S. I mean, that's understandable, right? But, you know, again, it's a really lengthy and difficult process. So sometimes then I get the question, well, I don't understand why they don't wait in line, right? The sort of invisible theoretical line that happens, all these other people are waiting, why aren't they waiting? And so I always give this example because it's not just for fun or to make up or to be humorous, it's legitimate. So the line to be able to come across as a Mexican national, if you're trying to file for a green card through a family member, which is the most common means of doing that, right now probably takes about 35 years, okay? So when somebody's looking at that and saying, look, I filed, my brother or my mother or whomever filed a petition for me back in 1998 or 1995, but I still can't use that petition. When am I ever going to be able to use it? And the reason they can't use it is because there's this very, very long line where all those people are waiting whose petitions were filed anywhere from 1997 or 8 all the way up until the present, right? And so then individuals are waiting. They have family in the US. They don't understand why they can't be able to use that to immigrate to the United States. And invariably, a lot of those individuals end up coming across the border anyhow because they don't understand the process of waiting 35 years. So one of the proposals of immigration reform is to sort of broaden the visa numbers available to individuals that are trying to lawfully immigrate to the United States, okay? Statistically speaking, it's well shown and proven that immigrants contribute widely, whether it's economically, you know, for a variety of reasons. They contribute far more than what they take away from our country. I get a lot of comments about, well, they don't pay taxes, you know. The vast majority of my clients pay taxes, and if they come in and they haven't paid taxes because they say, well, I don't have a social security number, I couldn't get one. Here's your instructions on how to get a tax ID number. Get yourself a tax ID number. You can get that. You're eligible. Go and file your taxes. File back taxes if you need to. We make sure that we try to get as many individuals as possible on the correct path. But the fact is, you don't have to have status in the United States in order to be able to file taxes. Okay? The difference is that if you're undocumented, someday, if you're paying taxes, and sometimes, albeit it will be with a social security number that's not of that individual's, and that absolutely happens. But what happens then is if they end up paying taxes for 20, 30 years or so on, and they never are able to legalize their status, any social security benefits down the road, they'll never see those benefits. Those go to the other individuals, or they simply just never see it. So it doesn't mean that individuals who don't have status in the U.S. aren't paying taxes. I know U.S. citizens who don't pay taxes, who pay cash under the table for work, right? It happens across the board. But the whole idea is you'd be surprised to know that even though a person is undocumented, the reality is they're only undocumented because they don't have a way to document themselves. And I also get that a lot in the comments about DACA students. You guys are probably all familiar with DACA, right? Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's been around since 2012. Basically, it said that if you were physically present in June of 2007, going forward, and you're under a certain age, that you could apply for this protection to be able to be in the U.S. Well, I've seen tons of debate on the internet and all these different forums to say, yeah, but if these kids have been here for so long, since they were, you know, months old, 2, 3, 4 years old, and they're getting DACA now, why in the world are they not filing for a green card or citizenship? And a lot of times it's like, why aren't they becoming U.S. citizen? Because people don't know, that don't understand immigration, that one, you can't jump from something straight to citizenship. You have to get a green card. You have to have status, right? And I always get that question, well, if they're such good kids and if they're not doing anything wrong, and if you're going to blame it on the parents, now that they're adults, why aren't they taking care of it? It's only because they can't, okay? Again, any kid who's here on DACA status, if they are going to be eligible to file for a green card, they're going to. They're going to. They're not just opting not to. It's super, super frustrating to be here in the US and not be able to move forward and feel a permanent sense of security. I don't know any DACA kids that if they have the opportunity to file for a green card that they wouldn't. The problem is DACA in and of itself by name is temporary. It's deferring the action to remove a child from the US. It does not give them any type of permanent status. Was there a question?
Yeah, I've got several questions.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, shoot.
So I'm going to do two questions, if you'll repeat them,
Yep.
that touch on what we were just talking about, and then
Sure.
I need to go backwards a little bit.
Okay.
So I actually posted a question, and I think they might be interested in hearing the answer. So we found out that if you're here undocumented and you want to get status, you have to go back to a country, your country of origin.
Mm-hmm.
And that can take 10 years or maybe longer.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of in your professional opinion from what you've seen, how likely is it that somebody's going to actually go back to their country of origin knowing they're going to have to wait for 10 years or so?
Yeah. So good question. So the question is, just so everybody can make sure to have heard it, is that when I mentioned earlier that oftentimes if somebody can't file for a green card in the US and they have to leave the United States to do it, that they may have to spend 10 years back in their home country before they'd be eligible, how likely is it that somebody is actually going to do that and go through that process of waiting that 10 years? So in answer to the question, it's not the norm, okay? The norm is that we can help individuals bypass that 10-year bar because they have the proper family relationship. So somebody can bypass the 10-year bar if they're married to a US citizen or they have a parent who has a green card or is a citizen, okay? But the problem is, and so that changes it from a 10-year process, an automatic 10-year wait, and it drops it down to that whole 2 to 3 year timeline that I was explaining of going through the process of filing a forgiveness application. And you get approved for it, and then you finish the green card interview abroad. The 10-year part, if you can't overcome it, when I get that question a lot is when somebody only has children who are US citizens and they think, or somebody's told them, oh sure, you can go through that process, no problem. And I have to tell them you can't because children don't provide that pathway. So when you hear comments about, oh, border babies, people are coming over here just to have their kids born in the US so that they can go ahead and legalize their status and use their child, and this is outrageous. Under the law, it's still not an option. And the reason is because once you come here without papers and you're here for 1 year or more without papers, the moment you leave, you're subject to that 10-year bar. It's automatic, and it can only be forgiven through a waiver, but you can only file that waiver if you have the proper family relative. It does not work if you have US citizen children. They can never help you to overcome that. So in answer to the question, I don't see it as much where I'm telling somebody that and I'm saying, go ahead and wait 10 years, follow up with me then, and we'll go ahead and get you started on your process. It doesn't happen because nobody at that point is prepared to leave. They may have young children or, their lives here in the US and established and so on, and the prospect of leaving for a full 10 years plus is so drastic for them that they just don't do it. Now, does it happen? And am I actually working on more than a few cases at the moment where, yes, a parent has been outside the US for 10 years? Absolutely. I'm even working on some where the departure occurred earlier on in my career. They didn't have the legal means, and we are now just starting to work on that process to help them immigrate back to the US lawfully. So it's definitely the minority of the time, but it does happen from time to time. And again, it's just because the fear of leaving, they're constantly hoping something will change that will allow them to fix their status in the United States.
Okay, one question is related to DACA.
Mm-hmm.
Can the DACA recipient apply for a green card here, or do they have to go back to their home country?
So good question. The question is, if you're a DACA recipient and you marry a US citizen, can you apply for a green card here, or do you have to leave and go back to your home country? So I'll answer that in a few ways because DACA has added some nuances to the whole idea of marriage to a US citizen. So when you have DACA, it gives you this temporary status, right? But if your original entry into the US was crossing the border without papers, that technically still is what the laws determine as your manner of entry. Okay, so they still say, even if you have DACA, but you originally entered without papers, you're still an individual who has entered without papers. So that means even when you're married to a U.S. citizen, DACA does not give you the type of status that forgives you and says you've now been lawfully admitted. You have permission to be here, but you haven't been lawfully admitted, okay? Unless you did come on a visa, overstay, and then just like any other overstay of a visa, you can file for a green card in the U.S. through a spouse. The way that we've been able to address that is, along with DACA, there's something called advanced parole. And advanced parole is a travel document that lots of individuals can file for, whether it's DACA or a pending green card or what have you, that basically allows an individual that when this travel document is approved, it allows them to temporarily travel outside the United States and return lawfully with lawful admission, presenting your parole document to the border officer and being lawfully admitted. When you do that, that changes your manner, your last admission to the U.S. You go from being a person who was admitted, who came across without papers, to a person who was lawfully admitted to the U.S. Now, there has been tons of litigation over this issue over the last several years, but generally speaking, if you have DACA, you travel on advanced parole, you re-enter with that permission, you can then file for a green card in the United States through your U.S. citizen spouse or sometimes through another type of family member if, again, there's other nuances to the law. But generally, it cures the issue of having originally been brought over without papers, okay? So there's a couple more points on that, so it's kind of a longer answer to the question. There is this case law that came out, these two cases that came out probably 7 or 8 years ago, and they're companion cases called Yerebelli and Arabelli. And this is not to get into the case law too much, but what those two cases said is an individual who has a travel document, who has permission like that, when they leave the U.S. for legal purposes, they're not legally departing, even though they're physically departing. Because if they were legally departing, they may be subject to that 10-year bar that I talked about. They're only departing for purposes of being able to legally re-enter. And that's a way that helps to protect DACA students as well. And the other thing that it protects is TPS. If you all have ever heard of temporary protected status, it's basically a special permission to be here in the U.S. temporarily that's afforded to certain countries and individuals who were here before a certain year that come from certain countries. Haiti is an example, Liberia was an example, El Salvador, Honduras. So there are several countries that have TPS status here in the U.S., Venezuela, and it's basically, again, like DACA, and then it's just temporary. It could go away at any time. A lot of times, several countries actually lost their TPS during our previous administration, but then there was a lot of litigation. There were injunctions that have stayed that, and so it's sort of continuing until all the litigation finishes up. That is another way when, in answering the question, if you marry a U.S. citizen or you have a way to get a green card in the U.S., if you have TPS status and you travel on that travel document, it is another way when you can sort of legally get around the issue of being barred if your original entry was without papers. So I know that's, Barbara, a longer answer to that question, but it's relevant. So.
One student is asking about visas.
Mm-hmm.
What's the best visa for students?
Oh, okay. So generally speaking, the best or the most common visa for students is the F1 student visa. I don't know how much of Georgia State's student population might be here on F1s. There are also J1s and there are Ms, which I rarely deal with. And even J1s, I don't deal with as often unless I'm on the receiving end of somebody who's going to change their status to something else. I do business immigration too, so work visas and things like that. F1s are the most common, the most generally accepted for regular undergraduate and graduate programs of study. Sometimes when you get into like postdoc and PhDs, you'll see more J1s, or training or internships, you'll see J1s. But otherwise, F1s would be the most common type of student visa. One important thing to know about using the term visa versus, let's say, status in the U.S., because a lot of people confuse this, my own clients confuse this all the time. So if I have a prospective student that, it's applying to Georgia State, wants to go to school, they're an international student, they would get issued something called an I-20 document, and the I-20 document will give all the school's information on it, the program of study, how long the program of study, so if it's a 4-year undergraduate degree, all that information is listed on there, right? So somebody applies for that, and let's say they're about to start school in the last couple of weeks, that I-20 may say that they're going to be in status from now for the next 4 years, and that means their F1 status will be set to expire 4 years from now, okay? Then they have that I-20, they go to the consulate abroad, their visa interview, they get their visa, and their visa may only be good for a year or something like that, or maybe 2 years or even less. And sometimes just to be able to use one time. Well, the visa that's in somebody's passport only says that they have permission to actually arrive into the United States, okay? So sometimes once you come in on that F1 visa and you're here, it's only that I-20 document and your stamp in your passport that actually governs your ability to be here, to attend school, and to be lawfully in the US. As long as you're attending school and you're engaged in your full-time program of study. So sometimes I have students who contact me because they had to drop out, they had health issues, they had family emergencies, things like that. And they need to know that if they discontinue their program of study, oftentimes they will do what's called fall out of status, and they will get dropped from the Department of Homeland Security's system, which is called SEVIS. It's SEVIS. That was the whole program that was implemented. So everything changed a lot after September 11th because a few of those individuals were here on F1 visas. So they completely revamped the program, added additional security checks and things like that. So I've had clients who have been here on F1 visas, fell out of status for one reason or another, they stopped going to classes. It's sometimes out of their control, sometimes not. And ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, be sure, will come knocking on their door within 30 days. And they are fairly on top of that. Yeah, did you have a question?
I did. So back in 2018, the Trump administration revoked the TPS for Hondurans who came here in the 90s from Hurricane Mitch.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I knew someone who was here who was student age. Could that person have applied for an F1 visa to continue their stay here?
So that's a really, really good question because this is, oh yeah, sorry. So the question was, she had a friend who originally had TPS status. She was from Honduras, right? And so again, TPS is that temporary status because of things, whether there's, extreme weather incidences or civil wars or things like that, that our government offers TPS. So she had TPS. Then the Trump administration rescinded TPS status for a few countries. And so could this individual then apply for, let's say, a student visa, or we could say any other type of visa? Is that possible? And I'll get to your question. Thank you. I see it. And so is that possible? Well, the reason it's a great question is because there's a golden rule that I have to talk about whenever I'm talking to anybody who's here on an F1 visa or any other type of visa. When you come into the United States lawfully with inspection with a visa, the golden rule is in order to lawfully remain in the US, you always have to remain in status. So if you're going to be here with an F1 visa and then you're hoping for a job upon graduation and you have an employer who may be willing to sponsor you for a work visa, because remember, you always have to stay here lawfully, what it means is that your change of status petition from F1 to, let's say, H1B is the example I'm using for a work visa. It has to be filed timely, meaning it has to be filed before the expiration of the F1 visa, because you cannot fall out of status and be out of status and then leap back into status. It's the same reason why individuals who are undocumented that may have started their own business, really doing well, contributing to the community, say, look, I have a great company and I'm employing a lot of individuals. I just don't have status. Can I invest? Can I do something just to get a work visa or get a green card through my company? And I always have to explain, generally speaking, no, because once you're out of status, you can't get back into status. And so in answer to the question about TPS and converting to an F1, TPS is not considered a lawful status. It's considered lawful permission to be in the US, and that's sort of a nuance in the terms. But because it's just a lawful permission to be here, it doesn't give a person the ability to file to change their status from TPS to an F1 visa. unfortunately. But I will tell you, and hopefully she knows this, and I don't know if you're still in touch with her, but again, through the federal courts, all of that was stayed. There were injunctions issued that prevented TPS from permanently ending for all of those individuals. So it's all still being litigated. There are automatic extensions of TPS status for Honduras, El Salvador, and so on. So she's technically okay right now. Okay?
And we are at 12:30, so I do know you need
Oh.
to finish soon. I know I can't.
Yeah, that flies by. Okay.
I did have a couple of short questions.
Sure.
You talked about to bypass the 10-year wait.
Mm-hmm.
It can't be because you have a citizen child.
Right.
And I think the student needs to be clear, is a spouse the only relation that qualifies you to bypass that wait?
So I'll give a sort of snippet of waivers overall. So generally speaking, in order to bypass the wait of having to leave the U.S. to go for a green card interview, only a spouse who has a green card or is a citizen, or a parent. Those are the only two family relationships that allow you to bypass that. Now, in addition to that type of waiver where you have to leave and wait and trying to get around that, there are other waivers. There are waivers if you have certain types of criminal convictions. There are waivers if you've ever lied on a visa application. Those other types of waivers do include other family relationships that may become an option, okay? So sometimes if somebody does come up and they have a criminal conviction, they may already have a green card, but then have a criminal conviction, so our government is trying to remove them from the United States, take their green card. Sometimes those convictions are 25 years old. Sometimes it was a shoplifting conviction of something, a $100 item from Macy's. That can subject somebody to being removed from the United States. In that case, sometimes you can file a waiver or forgiveness application that might be happening in immigration court before a judge. In those situations, children and sons and daughters, meaning adult versus under 21, can actually be included as qualifying relatives, but it's very, very limited, okay? And I know you had a question.
This goes back to birthright citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
So I know during the whole situation with Afghanistan,
Mm.
all the airlifts, there were, I think, 3 children that were born on U.S. military flights. But I know the U.S. military, if it's on a U.S. military aircraft, that isn't classified as U.S. land.
Mm-hmm.
So I know one of the children, like she just wanted, I believe she went into labor, but she was, born.
Mm-hmm.
She landed at Ramstein, which is the base in Germany. So would she be granted U.S. citizenship? Because she was, like, where's the line of where are you officially born in the eyes of immigration laws?
So that's another really good question, because when that happened and we... Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah. So the question was, it was in reference to everything that's just recently happened in Afghanistan, and stories of a few individuals, children, babies that were born mid-flight, born upon landing at the base, and different things like that. And in talking about birthright citizenship, where does the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act draw the line? And of course, going back to the 14th Amendment, the jurisdiction and things like that, where is the line drawn in terms of if a baby born mid-flight or landed on the ground at the base, if they have then conferred U.S. citizenship? And it's a really good question, and I don't have a definitive answer for it. And the reason I know that is because I'm on a few Facebook page groups of like immigration lawyers across the country, and we literally talked about this and debated over it for a few days, wondering whether or not those babies born would actually be able to confer. And I think what we determined is literally being on U.S. soil, which includes the base, probably there could be a legal argument made that child would be conferred, would confer U.S. citizenship, whereas still in the air, whether it's over international water, international airspace is international airspace, right? And so the thinking was, even though on a U.S. military aircraft, but I think the law probably would have erred on the side of still being in international airspace, probably not. And so I think that's where we sort of distinguish, but I have no doubt at some point something like that is going to be litigated because it's somewhat of a gray area. But that's my thinking. On the ground, possibly yes. In the air, probably not. Mm-hmm. Good question, though. Yeah. Okay, so the follow-up question was, if they are in the air and in international airspace, where do they belong? And the answer is, I don't know. But I would think that depending on the at least we'll say the mothers in this case, right? Because we can't be sure in terms of father or, that kind of thing. I would think that they would probably at least be inheriting the citizenship and nationality of the parent if that parent's country, so let's say if Afghanistan, and I don't know the answer to it offhand, confers birthright citizenship, like if children automatically derive citizenship from their parent based on the parent's nationality. So that would probably be the first thing to look at is, does that child have Afghan citizenship simply because mom holds an Afghan passport? So that would be the first thing that I would think, but it's not always the case. Again, so I'd have to look at that country's, specifically that country's laws to see if they automatically just derive from mom. Mm-hmm.
If I could, I know you've got to go, if we could squeeze in one quick question
Yeah.
from she's an online student, and she asked us a while back. And I think you were maybe talking about hearings or something, and she asked, is there a way that they can bypass so they won't have to call in, especially for emergencies when they have to travel? It was back at the beginning, I think you were referencing.
So maybe the question is if somebody has to be in immigration court, but they have an emergency and need to travel and can't be there. So the problem, I don't know if that's in reference to immigration court or other appointments, but generally if immigration appointments are scheduled, like USCIS, I have to leave on time because I'm headed to a green card interview and I've got to be there on time because we have to be there, otherwise it gets denied. And so in answer to that question about whether you can reschedule something or not be there if you have an emergency, when it comes to immigration interviews, green card citizenship, yes, you can reschedule if you can do it timely. But I can't just show up late because they'll probably say to me, you were a no-show, and they deny the application. Versus immigration court, you have to be there for immigration court, and if you're not, you have to have a seriously documented, really, really good excuse. You are in the emergency room, you have COVID, you've been exposed to COVID, the whole new guidelines we have to notify, of course. Otherwise, you will get ordered removed from the United States in absentia, which means without your presence. One of the hardest things to overcome in immigration court for us when we're trying to help somebody legalize their status. So I hope that helps to answer it. Thank you guys so much. I just want to leave. Can I just leave my email address real quick in case, since I know I have to run out.
I'll say something to you guys too when she walks out, okay?
Yeah, if anybody wants to ever email me or call me, so my email address is D for Danielle. Claffey is my last name. It's spelled C-L-A, F as in Frank, E-Y, @immigration.net. And I can leave my number too. And I don't mind fielding questions and that kind of, even if it's just talk more about immigration stuff. It's 404-949-8151. That's my voicemail.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I'll give them some more information to pass on to you if we need to.
Yeah.
Please give Ms. Claffey a round of applause and thank you.
Thank you guys.
Okay. Please drive safely.
I will. And the only other thing I'll say that I didn't even get to because there's so much content is there is a reconciliation bill that is up for a vote that is probably going to go to a vote in the next week and a half. And that reconciliation bill has worked into it immigration provisions. So anytime we hear about immigration reform, everybody puts their back up and it's big conflict and arguments. This reconciliation bill is addressing lots of different things, right? One part of it is immigration. It will change a ton for individuals here without status, for DACA recipients, for TPS. It provides pathways to green cards through what I was talking about, payment of fees, looking at criminal backgrounds, different things like that. So that might change drastically what we're doing for immigration in obviously months and years going forward.
I'll tell them what reconciliation is so they know.
Yeah, so yeah, basically it's actually called, I printed it out real quick, so it's the House Reconciliation Bill. But again, if you Google it, it's a wide variety of issues that are being addressed, not just immigration, but they've just worked some immigration provisions into it. So it could change things. So every time you've heard about the DREAM Act and things like that, and that never being able to pass to give a permanent path to green cards and citizenship for DACA recipients, this would finally do that. It's just not labeled the DREAM Act. Okay? All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. Take care.
Good luck at that hearing.
Thank you. It should go well.
So real quick, you guys may know that a lot of bills get stopped in the Senate. For example, because of the filibuster and the need to have 60 senators, support the bill or, agree not to block it. Well, when they use the reconciliation process, it's a power that's associated with the budget and appropriation powers. And so when they do that, you can get something, you can't filibuster that, basically. So you can actually get stuff done and get it passed in both chambers, and actually getting something passed in both chambers does only require a simple majority, which is over 50% of the members. But of course, in non-reconciliation issues, the filibuster can block things to where you're going to need more people to stop, to agree to end the filibuster and then let it pass. And so, so that is kind of a very strategic way to get some stuff done, is if you can put it in the reconciliation process, and that has to be approved. Senate parliamentarian, I won't get into how political that is. I'm not an expert on Congress, so that would be that situation. If you guys, if you do have a question, or if you want to post to that Padlet board, I can actually forward those to Ms. Claffey for you, and I'll just give my email address as well. I didn't actually introduce myself. I'm a professor in political science. I'm an instructor in political science on Newton campus, and I teach online. Barbara Robertson, and my email is brobertson@gsu.edu, so BROBERTSON. It's really simple. So I'll be happy to forward any questions that you have to Ms. Claffey. I want to remind you guys to go to vote.gsu.edu, check your registration status, get registered to vote, check your polling precinct, update your address if you need to. Make sure you guys are ready to go to vote. If not in Atlanta this November, vote in 2022, okay? Thank you so much. And if you guys got any questions for me, go ahead. If not, then you can leave. Thank y'all. Thank you. Thank you to those that attended virtually.